She never hated you, never screamed, never cheated, never said, "I wish I had never married you." But also, she never looked at you like a man she couldn't resist, never touched you like she craved you, never made you feel like her first choice. And the worst part, you felt it. Even if you didn't admit it at the time, you knew. This is for the man who stayed, who gave, who tried, and still ended up wondering, if she was never truly into me, why did she say "I do"? Part 1. The beginning that lied. She said yes, smiled in the pictures, showed off the ring, made wedding boards, picked flowers, chose colors, practiced her new last name. Everyone thought it was love, even you. But looking back now, with clearer eyes and a quieter heart, you see it for what it was. It wasn't you she loved. It was your idea of you. You were steady, available, kind, predictable. You weren't dangerous. You weren't hautix. You weren't exciting. But you were safe. And for a woman tired of games, weary of heartbreaks, exhausted by charming men who always disappeared, you were a relief. But relief, it isn't the same as reverence. You were the man she thought she should marry, not the one she dreamed about at night. You were a solution, not a spark. You were her exit plan from disappointment, not the desire she couldn't deny. And you? You were all in. You were in love. You were captivated by her softness, her laugh, her presence. You wanted to be her answer. And so, you ignored the signs, the way her kisses were slow, but hollow, the way she accepted the proposal, but didn't cry, the way she talked about the wedding, more than she talked about the marriage. She didn't fake it. She wasn't cruel. She just compromised, told herself attraction would grow, that admiration would become desire, that affection would turn into hunger. But it didn't. And while you planned a life, she planned a version of herself that could survive inside it. But love, real love, it cannot be negotiated into being. And what you mistook for yes was just a long, slow maybe. Part 2. The quiet distance. In the early years, you blamed yourself. Maybe if you worked out more, tightened the waistline, bulked up the arms. Maybe if you made more money, took that promotion, booked the trips, drove something newer. Maybe if you were more romantic, better at surprises, less predictable, more exciting. You thought, this is my fault. I must be missing something. Because she didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't leave. But she also didn't light up, didn't reach for you, didn't pull you closer at night. Her touch, it was polite, not passionate. Her eyes, they scanned the room, but rarely lingered on you. She smiled at the camera, held your hand at dinner, laughed with your friends. But when the door closed, so did she. She didn't hurt you with violence. She hurt you with her absence. And that's a slower death. Akiaterache, a form of heartbreak that leaves no bruises. Just a man silently wondering, what did I do wrong? But here's the truth. She was never all in. Not emotionally. Not physically. Not soul deep. You were good enough to marry. Respectable. Honorable. A man her mother would approve of. But not the man who made her heart race. Not the one who stole her breath when he walked into the room. And the worst part? You felt it. Long before you admitted it. You knew, in the way she turned her back after sex, in the way she hesitated before saying, "I love you," in the way she never looked at you like you were fire. You weren't despised. You endured. And that difference? It eats a man slowly, until he's left staring at a love that never had heat, just habit. Part 3. The type of man she marries. There are 3 types of men in a woman's life, and if you've lived long enough, you've probably been all 3. 1. The man she burns for. He's not always stable, but he makes her feel alive. He walks into the room, and she forgets the rest of it exists. There's fire in her voice when she says his name. She checks her phone for his texts. She wonders where he is, what he's thinking, who he's with. He's not always kind, not always ready, but he ignites something in her. She doesn't plan to love him. She just does, wildly, recklessly, completely. 2. The man she settles for. He's good, solid, safe. He shows up, says the right things, loves her gently. He checks every box except the one marked desire. She chooses him with her head, but not with her heart. She tells herself, this is the kind of man I need, the kind I can build a future with. And sometimes, that's enough. Until it isn't. 3. The man she never saw. He was kind. He listened. He waited. But she never looked twice. He wasn't tall enough, confident enough, challenging enough. He was invisible. You were the second man, the man she chose, but never craved. And there's nothing wrong with you. But here's the harsh truth. If a woman doesn't feel it in the beginning, she won't feel it years later. You can't provide your way into passion, can't protect your way into her attraction. You can be everything she says she wants, and still never be the one her soul leans toward in silence. And when that happens, you're not in a marriage, you're in a quiet contract, signed with good intentions, but sealed without longing. Part 4. The marriage of maybes. It wasn't a bad marriage. That's the hardest part. No screaming, no slamming doors, no betrayals, no public scandals. You had good days, shared meals, took vacations, laughed at movies. From the outside, it looked stable, respectable, decent. But inside, something felt missing, a subtle ache, a weight you couldn't name, a distance that grew not from neglect, but from the absence of depth. You didn't feel hated. You felt invisible. You brought her coffee, rubbed her shoulders, listened to her talk about her day. But the warmth never deepened. The intimacy never bloomed. The spark never caught. You weren't starving for attention. You were starving for reciprocation. And what made it worse? She never rejected you. She just didn't reach for you. She played her part, smiled in public, posted anniversary pictures, tagged you in my rock captions. But behind closed doors, you felt the gap. She made love, but rarely initiated it. She listened, but rarely asked how you felt. She stayed, but never leaned in. And that's the marriage most men are stuck in. The marriage of maybes. Maybe she'll soften. Maybe the fire will come back. Maybe this is just a rough season. Maybe I'm overthinking it. But here's the truth. Love doesn't grow where longing never existed. You weren't the problem. You were just the convenient answer. And when a man becomes convenient to the woman he loves, he starts questioning his own worth. Not because she hurt him, but because she never truly saw him. Part 5. The silent burnout. Burnout doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes, it looks like a man smiling, still showing up, still paying the bills, still asking, what do you want for dinner? But inside, he's eroding. And the worst part is, no one sees it. Because he doesn't scream. He doesn't complain. He doesn't slam the door and leave. He just stops shining, stops laughing from the gut, stops teasing her in the kitchen, stops reaching out when she rolls away in bed. At first he tried. God, he tried. He changed his haircut, learned her love language, planned anniversaries, asked, what do you need from me? And meant it. But over time, the more he reached, the more he felt alone in the space between them. So he started pulling back, not to punish her, but to preserve what little of himself was still intact. He didn't stop loving her. He just stopped begging to be loved back. That's how men burn out in marriage. Not in explosions, but in slow extinguishing, one unmet need at a time, one silent night after another, one gesture ignored, until he no longer knows why he's still trying. He turns into a ghost in his own home. Not because he left, but because the connection did. And when you look into a woman's eyes and see kindness, but not desire, you start asking questions that no man should have to ask. Am I her partner? Or just her provider? Am I loved? Or am I just convenient? When a man starts asking those questions alone, he starts imagining what peace might feel like. Somewhere else. Part 6. When men stay too long. Men stay too long, not because they're weak, but because they're wired for duty. We fight for what we build. We sacrifice for what we vow. We endure. And sometimes, we endure far past the point of return. You stayed through the coldness, through the months of emotional distance, through the years of quiet disappointment. You told yourself, this is what commitment looks like. This is normal. This is what marriage becomes after the spark fades. But here's the truth you buried. You were afraid. Afraid to leave. Afraid to disappoint. Afraid to start over. Afraid to admit that what you built Wasn't built on mutual wanting, but qui est obligation. You rationalized. You said, at least we don't fight. You said, she's a good woman. You said, we've made it this far. But surviving isn't thriving, and longevity doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes it just means you're too tired to uproot the lie. The longer you stayed, the more invisible you became. Not because she stopped seeing you, but because you stopped seeing yourself. You gave up little things, your voice, your preferences, your needs, your edge, and by the end, you weren't just unloved. You were unrecognizable. That's what happens to men who stay too long. They don't leave broken, they leave empty. And emptiness is harder to rebuild than heartbreak. Because heartbreak still has feeling. Emptiness is just echo. And when a man lives in echo long enough, he forgets what his own voice sounds like. Part 7. The breaking point. It didn't happen during a fight. There was no shouting, no tears, no door slamming at midnight. It happened in the stillness, at the kitchen table, on a Tuesday. She came home late. No explanation, just said, traffic, and reached for her phone. You had cooked, set the table, lit a candle even. She barely looked, barely touched the food, barely spoke. And as you watched her scroll, laugh at someone else's post, sigh at something on her feed, you realized something chilling. She hadn't wondered about you all day. Not how you were, not what you needed, not what your silence meant. That night, you laid next to her, but miles apart. You listened to her breathing, stared at the ceiling, and whispered into the dark, if I disappeared tomorrow, would she miss me, or just the things I do for her? And that question, it cracked something inside you, not with rage, but with resignation. Because when a man no longer feels missed, he no longer feels necessary. You thought about all the years, all the holidays, all the inside jokes, all the quiet efforts she never noticed. You weren't looking for perfection. You weren't asking for fireworks. You just wanted to feel wanted. But when presence becomes an expectation, and effort is met with indifference, even the most loyal man begins to slip into silence. That night, you knew this wasn't a marriage, it was a contract, a schedule, a routine dressed in rings. And routines don't bleed when you leave them. They just replace you. Part 8. The quiet exit. When a woman leaves, she usually says something. She writes a letter. She explains. She cries. She asks for space. But when a man leaves, especially a man who stayed too long, he leaves quietly. You didn't pack with rage. You folded shirts with care, left the drawers cleaner than you found them. No yelling, no accusations, no final blow, just one bag, and a peace you hadn't felt in years. You didn't leave to punish her. You left to rescue yourself, because at some point, you stopped trying to resuscitate what no longer breathes. You left the house key on the counter, or maybe just the garage remote. No, goodbye. Not because you were heartless, but because words wouldn't have mattered. She wouldn't have understood. She hadn't been listening for a long time. You got in the car, turned the engine, and for the first time in forever, you weren't driving to prove anything. You were just leaving the version of you that waited too long. That explained too much. That hoped too hard. And when the calls came in days or weeks later, you didn't rush to answer. You didn't rehearse a speech. You just said, I'm not angry. I'm just done disappearing to make someone else feel comfortable. You weren't leaving love. You were leaving the illusion of it. You were done being the solution to someone who didn't see your soul. Because when a man finally understands what peace feels like, he stops trading it for proximity. And when he chooses himself, he doesn't need applause. He doesn't need closure. He just walks away, with silence as his final boundary. Part 9. The aftermath. They didn't understand. Of course they didn't. To them, she was a good woman. Polite, respectable, never unfaithful, never loud. They said, you just hit a rough patch. All marriages go through this. You walked away from something solid. But what they didn't see was how hollow that solid had become. They didn't see the dinners eaten in silence, the nights you laid back to back for hours, the birthdays forgotten, not from malice but from disinterest. No one saw how many times you bit your tongue, swallowed disappointment, lowered your standards just to keep peace. No one heard you cry in the car. Not because she hurt you with words, but because she never had any to offer. You weren't mourning a divorce. You were mourning the years spent slowly vanishing. You grieved the man you used to be. Before you bent so far, you forgot your own shape. And still, you didn't speak ill of her. You didn't justify your leaving. You didn't beg for others to take your side. You just breathed deeply for the first time in years. And when she finally called, not to scream, not to cry, just to ask, "Are you really not coming back?" You didn't hesitate. You didn't flinch. You didn't twist the knife. You just answered, softly, but finally, "I didn't leave because I stopped loving. I left because I stopped disappearing." And because what no one teaches men is this: sometimes the cost of staying is your identity. And when the price of peace is you stop paying. You weren't chosen for your passion. You were chosen for your predictability. Not because you lit up her world, but because you made it easier. She didn't chase you. She calculated you. And you, being a man who leads with loyalty, took that as love. But there's a pain deeper than betrayal. It's being committed to, but not desired by. And you felt it in the way she kissed you like a routine, in the way she touched you out of obligation, in the way she praised your effort, but never craved your presence. You weren't hated. You were tolerated. And that's a poison too quiet for the world to notice, but potent enough to make a man unravel in private. So here's what I'll tell you now. If you've ever felt like the placeholder, the safe option, the right guy who never stirred her fire, don't carry shame. Don't carry anger. Just carry truth. Because once you see it, once you really see what it's like to be wanted out of convenience, not out of genuine hunger, you stop settling for lukewarm. You stop explaining yourself to silence. You stop twisting into shapes that no longer feel like you. You realize love should not feel like a negotiation. It should feel like recognition. So walk alone, not bitter, not broken, just wide awake. Because sometimes the most masculine thing a man can do is walk away from a woman who said, "I do," but never meant it with her eyes, her hands, her soul. And when you walk away like that, you don't leave in anger. You leave in honor. You leave with your reflection intact, your spine straight, your peace untraded. Because now, you're not looking to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. He stayed too long, but not one day longer. And sometimes, that's what healing sounds like. Silence, followed by the sound of his own footsteps, walking home to himself,